The question is that the motion be agreed to.
Mr Speaker.
Phil Twyford.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I'll give this to the government. This budget is an example of clever politics. There's been a lot of giving with one hand and taking away with the other. But for all those New Zealanders who are looking for more than sleight of hand, who want a plan for New Zealand, some kind of idea about how we can create a better future for our children, this budget has been a big disappointment. It has offered nothing for the regions, nothing to diversify our economy and grow our prosperity, and nothing to fix the housing crisis. It is a budget of squandered opportunities, and that theme applies pretty much to the government's entire housing policy. Let me say for the record that pushing this bill through under budget urgency is a cynical abuse of this Parliament and its processes. There is no reason that we've heard last night or today from the ministers and the chair, from Joe Goodhue who just spoke, or any of the government members, why this bill has to be rammed through the House under urgency. There is nothing in the bill or in anything that any government members have said that explains why this bill should be denied the proper scrutiny of a select committee process and the chance for members of the public to come along and make submissions. This bill and the government's social housing policy shows how absolutely bankrupt of ideas the National Party is when it comes to fixing the housing crisis. They won't build the vast numbers of affordable houses that are desperately needed to relieve the housing shortage in Auckland. Instead, we get these silly little special housing areas that are basically lines on a map, creating little zones for fast-track consenting. And what have they achieved? In a year and a half, they've seen the building of 170 houses in Auckland, when the city needs 13,000 every year just to stand still. Every day, the shortage of houses in Auckland is getting bigger. It's currently 20,000 and it's getting bigger all the time. They refuse to crack down on speculators that are driving house prices higher and higher, both local and foreign, who are driving house prices beyond the reach of ordinary people. Instead, what do we get? Some half-hearted, rushed, panicked measure to tighten up the taxation rules, sir. And the result of that is that Treasury's own analysis indicates that policy won't catch more than 1,000 speculators a year. Social housing and the intent of this bill should be designed to help the most vulnerable people in our society, the people who never will be able to, under their own steam and the current economy, own a home of their own. That's the point of social housing in modern New Zealand. It's there to be part of the modern safety net. The intent of this bill is to make it easier for the minister. In fact, it gives the minister extraordinarily wide-ranging powers to do sweetheart deals with the property developers that this government is pinning all its hopes on to buy the houses that no one else wants. They've tried to, for the last 6 months, they've tried to convince New Zealand that the thousands and billions of dollars worth of state houses this government wants to sell were going to go to charities and to NGOs and to the community sector. That was a front. It is a fig leaf designed to give a veneer of respectability to a policy that is deeply unpopular with New Zealanders, and that is the hocking off of billions of dollars of publicly owned state houses to the National Party's property developer mates. This government refuses to change the planning rules to allow us to build more and better houses. And they've been talking about it since 2006, blaming the RMA, and Bill English still gets up in this House and blames the RMA, and that the National Party has done nothing. In 7 years in government, they haven't yet brought a proposal to this House to reform the RMA to make housing more affordable. They have no credibility in that area. So instead of doing the very thing, Mr. Speaker, the very thing that the most logical, simple, obvious thing to do in the middle of a housing crisis when there's a shortage of houses, the obvious thing to do is to build more houses, to build houses for young Kiwi families, good, decent, hard-working New Zealanders who only want to own a home of their own. They need a government that will stand up on their side and build more houses. National refuses to do that. The people in New Zealand who are most vulnerable, who are struggling on household incomes that barely allow them to survive, who struggle to get a decent roof over their heads, they need more and better state housing. And what's this government's answer? To sell off the houses that it already owns, as if by changing the ownership, it's going to make the slightest difference to the shortage of housing. It is, as Annette King memorably described it, an ideological burp, a bit of ideological reflux from the 1990s by Bill English, who back then introduced market rents for state housing and sold off 13,000 houses that ended up in the hands of private landlords and property speculators. This is simply a continuation of that policy. The difference is that this National Party has tried to dress it up by saying the Salvation Army were going to buy the houses in order to try to reassure New Zealanders about this deeply unpopular policy. This bill gives the Minister the flexibility and the wide-ranging powers to do sweetheart deals with property developers to get rid of the houses. Bill English, who is the architect of this policy, he simply wants to get rid of state houses off the government books. He doesn't care who they go to. He'll give them away. This is a fire sale of state houses on a massive scale. Billions of dollars of public assets that were paid for by state house tenants and taxpayers over generation are being flicked off by this national government because Bill English has an ideological agenda. He doesn't want the state owning these houses. He doesn't want the state to have an active role in the delivery of decent housing for the most vulnerable New Zealanders. He would much rather replace that system with a subsidy that goes direct, a taxpayer's subsidy, direct into the pockets of landlords. That's what Bill English wants to do. At least he's been candid about it. Forget the mealy-mouthed platitudes that we hear from the mouth of Paula Bennett. Let's look at how the government has tried to justify this con job that they call social housing reform. The first thing they say is that the houses, they say 1/3 of the houses are in the wrong place and are the wrong size. Well, in spite of the fact that that was flatly contradicted by Housing New Zealand in their recent annual report, it begs the question, Mr. Speaker, how selling the houses to someone else will magically ensure that those houses are the right size and are in the right place. It's a fallacy. Paula Bennett repeatedly makes the claim that community organisations can do a better job than Housing New Zealand. As Phil Goff pointed out, they have no evidential basis for making that claim. We asked Paula Bennett under the Official Information Act to provide the evidence, to provide the data. She said no such document exists. Simon Bridges got up from the chair during the committee stages of this debate and said, we want to build more warm, dry homes and build lovely modern homes for people. That's why we're passing this bill. Well, sir, to be honest, that is brainless. There is no need to sell billions of dollars of state houses to your property developer mates. Just insulate the houses. Just redevelop them. Build more houses. That is what New Zealanders want. So this is an ideological agenda by the National Party. They are withdrawing the government from the provision of decent housing for New Zealanders. They want a market-based approach. They simply want the houses off the government's books, and Labor will not support that. Sir, we're not against building up a stronger community housing sector. In fact, as members will know, I've given some very good speeches in the House and elsewhere making the case for that. But we will not stand by and allow the community housing sector and many fine organisations to have their good reputations cynically used and manipulated by this government to lend a veneer of respectability to their policy. The answer to the housing crisis is simple, Mr. Speaker. We have a shortage of houses. Just build more houses.
I call Matt Ducey.